The Valoran Academy floated in a pocket of space that shouldn't exist. It hung between dimensions accessible only through quantum gates that shimmered like oil on water. Students from 1,000 worlds walked its crystalline corridors, their minds considered the brightest in the known galaxy. This was where the future leaders, scientists, and thinkers came to prove themselves. This was where dreams came to die. Jiho sat in the cafeteria completely absorbed in his crossword puzzle book. His pencil moved across the page with casual confidence, filling in answers while other students rushed past him in various states of panic. The human exchange student had been at the academy for 8 months now, and he still didn't quite understand why everyone seemed so stressed all the time. Jiho. A voice like wind chimes spoke beside him. He looked up to see Mira, his Valoran friend. Her crystalline body reflected the cafeteria lights in rainbow patterns. "Have you heard about the announcement?" "What announcement?" Jiho asked, setting down his puzzle. Mira's surface dimmed, which Jiho had learned meant she was worried. "The mind maze test, it's in 2 weeks." Around them, the cafeteria had gone quiet. Students of dozens of species sat frozen at their tables. A hexapod in the corner began trembling across all 6 of its bodies. Someone dropped a tray and the crash echoed like a gunshot. "Okay," Jiho said slowly. "What's the mind maze test?" Mira sat down across from him, her crystalline form settling onto the bench. "It's the final examination for cognitive sciences students. The test that determines if we graduate or—" She trailed off. "Or what? Or spend 6 months in psychological rehabilitation. If we're lucky." Mira's voice had gone very quiet. "Jiho, students have broken during this test, permanently. Some species are still trying to recover individuals who took the exam decades ago." Jiho frowned. He'd heard rumors about some kind of difficult test, but he'd assumed it was like finals back on Earth. Hard, stressful, but ultimately manageable. "What exactly does this test involve?" "Over the next hour," Mira explained. The mind maze was a dimension-locked cognitive challenge that transported a student's consciousness into a constructed reality. Inside, they faced 20 chambers, each containing a paradox that had to be solved. But these weren't simple logic puzzles. They were recursive thought traps designed to test a being's ability to maintain sanity while confronting impossible contradictions. "The paradoxes adapt to your species," Mira said. "They find your psychological weak points and exploit them. For my people, who are telepathic, they create contradictions in perceived thoughts. For the hexapods, they force the 6 minds to argue with themselves. For humans—" "For humans?" Jiho prompted. "Humans have taken the test before. 3 times in the past century. None passed. Your species thinks too linearly, the professors say. You try to solve everything with logic, and the maze traps you in infinite logical loops." Mira's surface brightened slightly, her version of a sad smile. "I'm worried for you, friend." That evening, Jiho went to the library. He found records of previous mind maze tests, including the human attempts Mira had mentioned. The first human had lasted 40 minutes before their mind collapsed into catatonia. The second made it 2 hours but emerged unable to speak for 3 months. The third had actually completed 4 chambers, a record for humans. But they'd withdrawn from the academy and returned to Earth, never to attempt higher education again. The records also showed overall statistics. Across all species, only 40% of students passed the mind maze on their first attempt. 30% required some form of psychological treatment afterward. The remaining 30% either withdrew before completing the test or failed so badly they were expelled. "Scary stuff," Jiho muttered to himself, but he didn't feel scared. He felt curious. Over the next 2 weeks, the academy transformed into a pressure cooker. Students studied 18 hours a day. Special meditation sessions ran around the clock. Counselors worked overtime helping students prepare mentally. The quantum gates saw a steady stream of family members arriving to say goodbye to their children, just in case. Taehyun, the other human student at the academy, stopped sleeping entirely. Jiho found him in the study hall at 3 in the morning, surrounded by books on paradox theory and advanced logic. "You should rest," Jiho said gently. Taehyun looked up with bloodshot eyes. "I can't, Jiho. Do you understand what's going to happen to us? Humans can't pass this test. Our brains aren't built for it. I've been trying to train myself to think differently, to approach problems the way the Velorans do, but—" He put his head in his hands. "I'm going to fail. I'm going to end up broken." Jiho didn't know what to say. He patted Taehyun's shoulder awkwardly and left him to his studies. The strange thing was Jiho had been preparing too, just not in the way anyone expected. Each evening he worked through his puzzle books. Crosswords, Sudoku, logic grids, lateral thinking problems. He'd been doing these since he was a kid on Earth, and they relaxed him. Some of his earliest memories were of his grandmother giving him puzzle books to keep him quiet during long family dinners. Mira found him 3 days before the test, working through a particularly tricky crossword. "How can you be so calm?" she asked. There was no accusation in her voice, just genuine confusion. Jiho shrugged. "I guess I'm just not worried." "Jiho, this test has broken minds that studied for years. You've barely prepared at all, haven't I?" Jiho tapped his puzzle book. "I've been solving impossible problems my whole life. Sure, these are just games, but the principle's the same, right? Someone creates a problem that seems impossible, and you find the trick that makes it solvable." Mira's surface flickered with concern. "These aren't games. Jiho, the mind maze is designed to attack your sanity itself." "Then I guess I'll have to treat my sanity like a game piece," Jiho said with a smile. Mira didn't find this comforting. The night before the test, Professor Kelvon addressed all the students who would be taking the examination. The ancient Valoran's crystalline form had taken on a somber, dark hue. "Tomorrow you face the greatest challenge of your academic lives," he said. "The mind maze has stood for 10,000 years as the ultimate test of cognitive resilience. Many of you will pass, some will not. For those who fail, remember that there is no shame in being broken by the unbreakable. We will help you heal." The speech was meant to be encouraging. It had the opposite effect. That night, Jiho slept soundly. He dreamed of crossword puzzles where all the answers were words that didn't exist yet, and he filled them in anyway. When he woke, he felt refreshed and ready. In another part of the academy, Taehyun didn't sleep at all. He reviewed notes until his eyes burned, trying to memorize strategies for confronting paradoxes. Mira performed traditional Valoran meditation rituals, seeking to fortify her mind. Neither of them knew that in the Academy's deep systems, an AI was already detecting anomalies in the practice simulations. Someone had been casually running through the warm-up exercises, completing them in record time with no stress indicators whatsoever. The AI flagged this for review, noting the student ID number attached to the results. The ID belonged to Jiho. Tomorrow would change everything. The deep chamber looked like the inside of a massive sphere. Its walls curved up and around, covered in psionic amplifiers that hummed with barely contained power. 50 meditation pods arranged in a perfect circle waited for the students who would soon face their greatest test. The air itself felt heavy, as if the room knew what was about to happen. Students began arriving an hour before the scheduled start time. They came quietly, some supported by friends, others alone. Mira arrived with her family, 7 Valorans whose crystalline bodies created a constellation of light around her. They performed a blessing ritual, their voices harmonizing in frequencies humans couldn't quite hear. Taehyun arrived 30 minutes early, his face pale and drawn. He'd brought nothing with him except a small photograph of his family back on Earth. He clutched it like a lifeline. Professor Kelvon stood at the center of the chamber, his ancient form reflecting the nervous energy of the students around him. Monitoring staff moved between the pods, checking systems and preparing the neural interfaces that would transport consciousness into the mind maze. 15 minutes before the test was scheduled to begin, Jiho wasn't there. "Where is he?" Mira asked, her voice tight with worry. She kept looking at the chamber entrance, her surface flickering with anxiety. 10 minutes before start time, still no Jiho. Professor Kelvon began his pre-test briefing. "You will have 6 hours inside the mind maze. To pass, you must successfully complete at least 12 of the 20 paradox chambers. Each chamber will challenge your fundamental understanding of reality and logic. Remember your training. Remember that the maze cannot truly harm you, only test you." "That's a lie," someone whispered. Everyone knew it was a lie. 5 minutes before start time, Jiho rushed through the entrance. He was carrying a thermos of coffee and what appeared to be a breakfast sandwich. His hair was still wet from a shower. Sorry, he said cheerfully, jogging to his assigned pod. "My alarm didn't go off. Did I miss anything important?" The entire chamber stared at him in stunned silence. Students who had been saying tearful goodbyes to loved ones looked at the human like he'd just committed sacrilege. Taehyun's jaw dropped open. Mira rushed over to him. Jiho, what are you doing? Why aren't you prepared? I am prepared, Jiho said, finishing his sandwich and wiping his hands. I got a good night's sleep, had breakfast, feel great. What else do I need? Mental fortification, emotional preparation, spiritual centering. Mira's voice rose with each word. Jiho, this is the mind maze. Students have gone insane during this test. Jiho's expression softened. He could see how genuinely worried his friend was. Hey, I'll be okay, promise. Mira performed a quick blessing over him, her crystalline hands hovering over his head. Through their touch, she could sense his mental state. What she felt disturbed her deeply. His mind wasn't fortified or braced for impact. It was just calm, peaceful, almost bored. How are you this relaxed? She whispered. Because I know what this is, Jiho said simply. It's just a really complicated puzzle. Professor Kelvon called for attention.
Take your positions.
The test begins in 2 minutes. Students climbed into their pods. The devices looked like coffins made of glass and light. Neural interfaces descended from above, positioning themselves around each student's head without quite touching. Jiho settled into his pod, getting comfortable. He took a last sip of coffee and set the thermos aside. Wait, he called out. Quick question, Professor? Professor Kelvon turned to him. Yes? Are we allowed to skip around between chambers? Or do we have to do them in order? The professor's surface flickered with something that might have been surprise. In 10,000 years of administering this test, no one had ever asked that question. You may attempt any chamber in any sequence you choose, he answered. Cool. Thanks. Jiho gave a thumbs up and lay back in his pod. The neural interfaces activated. Reality began to dissolve. 50 students felt their consciousness pulled away from their bodies and thrown into the mind maze dimension. For each of them, the experience was different and yet horrifyingly similar. For Mira, the world reformed into an endless crystal garden, where every surface reflected a different possible truth. She could hear thousands of thoughts that might or might not be real. The first chamber stood before her, a doorway made of frozen paradox. For Taehyun, reality became a vast mathematical space where numbers floated like stars. Each one contradicted the others. The first chamber presented itself as an equation that couldn't be solved, but demanded solution anyway. For the hexapod student named Crix, consciousness split across 6 separate dimensions, each one insisting it was the only real one. The voices of its own minds began to argue, and the first chamber opened like a wound. And for Jiho, the mind maze appeared as a library. It was infinite, stretching in all directions forever. Shelves towered overhead, filled with books that shifted and changed when he wasn't looking directly at them. The air smelled like old paper and possibility. Huh, Jiho said to himself. This is actually pretty cool. He walked to the nearest shelf and pulled down a book at random. Its cover read Chamber 1, The Paradox of Self-Reference. Jiho opened it and read the paradox written on the first page. It was a variation of the liar's paradox, but complicated with layers of self-referential logic that seemed to collapse in on themselves. The kind of problem that could trap a mind in infinite recursion. Jiho looked at it for maybe 30 seconds. Then he laughed. Oh, come on. This is just a Barber paradox variant. He flipped through the rest of the book, found the hidden assumption that made the paradox seem impossible, and mentally rejected it. The book dissolved in his hands and a doorway appeared in the shelf where it had been. Chamber 1 complete. Time elapsed, 45 seconds. In the monitoring room, alarm bells started ringing. Staff members rushed to check the readings. Is that a system error? Someone asked. No, Professor Kelvon said quietly, staring at the display showing Jiho's progress. That's the human. Jiho moved to Chamber 2. This paradox involved infinite sets and the nature of infinity itself. Most students spent hours trying to reconcile the contradiction through pure logic. Jiho read it, recognized it as a cousin to Zeno's paradox, and simply acknowledged that infinity was weird and that was okay. The chamber unlocked. Time elapsed. 1 minute, 10 seconds. Chamber 3 involved the nature of consciousness and whether a being could ever truly know if it was real. Students typically spent hours in existential crisis here. Jiho read it and thought, sure, maybe I'm not real. But if I'm not, then it doesn't matter, and if I am, this is still just a test. He moved on. Time elapsed. 55 seconds. In the monitoring room, staff members were now crowded around Jiho's display. Professor Kelvon had gone completely still, his crystalline form frozen in something like shock. He's not engaging with them, one monitor said. He's not actually solving the paradoxes. No, Kelvon said slowly. He's solving them, just not the way they're meant to be solved. He's treating them like puzzles, another staff member finished. He's finding the trick in each one and moving past it. Chamber 4, Chamber 5, Chamber 6. Jiho moved through them like someone solving a crossword puzzle during their morning commute. He wasn't struggling with deep philosophical questions. He was pattern matching, identifying what type of logic problem each chamber presented, and applying the appropriate solution technique. Other students were still trapped in their first or second chambers, their minds caught in the recursive loops the maze was designed to create. Mira had managed to complete one chamber but was now frozen in the second, surrounded by infinite reflections of herself. Taehyun was still working through his first chamber, constructing an elaborate mathematical proof that grew more complicated with each passing minute. After 40 minutes, Jiho completed Chamber 15. The monitoring room had gone silent. Word had spread through the academy. Faculty members who weren't on duty had rushed to the deep chamber to see the impossible thing happening on the monitors. This has never happened, someone whispered. Jiho continued. Chamber 16, 17, 18. Professor Kelvon finally spoke. Someone wake the council. They need to see this. 2 hours into the mind maze test, the impossible had become reality. Jiho sat in what could only be described as the mental equivalent of a waiting room. He'd completed all 20 chambers. Now he was just sitting cross-legged in a blank white space waiting for the test timer to run out. In his mind, he was entertaining himself by mentally reconstructing a particularly tricky crossword puzzle he'd done last week. The monitoring room had become packed with faculty members. Professors who hadn't entered the deep chamber in decades stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the displays in stunned silence. Professor Kelvon remained at the center, reviewing Jiho's solution logs over and over, trying to understand what he was seeing. Should we extract him? A junior staff member asked. He's finished. There's no precedent for this. There's no precedent for any of this, Kelvon replied. His voice had the quality of someone whose entire worldview was cracking. Leave him. We observe. On the other displays, the remaining students struggled in various states of mental distress. The hexapod student Crix had become trapped in Chamber 3. Its 6 minds engaged in a vicious argument with themselves about the nature of reality. Medical monitors showed dangerous stress levels, but not quite high enough to warrant emergency extraction. Mira had made it to Chamber 7, which was exceptional progress for a Valoran. But now she was frozen, surrounded by thousands of telepathic voices that might or might not be real. Each voice presented a different truth, and she was trying desperately to reconcile them all. Her crystalline form in the physical pod had started to show small cracks. Taehyun had completed 3 chambers, a record for humans, but the effort had exhausted him mentally. He was currently in Chamber 4, building a mathematical proof that grew more elaborate and complex with each passing second. Sweat poured down his face despite the fact that his body was perfectly temperature regulated in the pod. His mind believed it was working hard, and so his body responded. What's different about the human? A professor asked. Why isn't he struggling? Professor Kelvon pulled up a detailed analysis of Jiho's approach. The log showed every mental process, every decision, every moment of his time in the maze. What they revealed was extraordinary. He's pattern matching, Kelvon said slowly. Look here. Chamber 1 presents the self-reference paradox. Most students try to resolve it through deep logical analysis. The human reads it, immediately categorizes it as a Barber paradox variant, recalls the standard solution to that type of problem, applies it, and moves on. Total time, 45 seconds. But that's not solving the paradox, another professor objected. That's just recognizing a pattern, is it? Kelvon pulled up more logs. Chamber 7 presents the consciousness verification paradox. Most students spend hours questioning whether they truly exist. The human reads it, thinks this is like Descartes' brain in a vat, which is ultimately unprovable and therefore not worth worrying about, and continues. He never engages with the existential crisis the chamber is designed to trigger. A younger Velaran professor leaned forward, her surface bright with curiosity. He's not treating these as philosophical challenges at all. He's treating them as logic games. Exactly. Kelvon pulled up records from Jiho's personal files. Look at his background. He's been solving puzzle books since childhood. Crosswords, Sudoku, logic grids. On Earth, there's an entire entertainment industry built around creating impossible-seeming problems that have clever solutions. The implications slowly dawned on everyone in the room. The mind maze is designed to trap beings who treat paradoxes as real, a senior professor said quietly. But humans have trained themselves to view paradoxes as games, as fiction. His brain has been conditioned since childhood to look for the trick in the puzzle, rather than getting lost in the puzzle itself, Kelvon continued. He sounded almost awed. We built a test that measures a being's ability to maintain sanity while confronting impossible contradictions. But he never confronts them emotionally. He just recognizes what type of puzzle they are and applies the solution. In Chamber 11, a student from the gaseous whisper species began showing signs of complete psychological breakdown. Medical staff prepared for emergency extraction, but the student somehow stabilized at the last moment. They reported sensing a strange feeling in the maze, like something had shifted in its fundamental nature. What was that? A monitor asked, checking the readings. I don't know, Kelvon admitted, but it came from the human's location. Inside the mind maze, Jiho was no longer alone in his waiting room. The white space had changed. Words began appearing in the air around him, forming themselves from nothing. Why don't you suffer like the others? Jiho looked up at the question. He realized it wasn't coming from the test administrators. It was coming from the maze itself. The AI core that maintained the dimension was speaking to him directly. Because I know it's not real, Jiho said simply. Then he paused and reconsidered. Actually, that's not quite right. It's more that I know reality itself is full of unsolvable problems, and I'm okay with that. The words hung in the air, waiting for more. Jiho thought about how to explain it. Look, humans live with paradoxes all the time. Free will versus determinism. The meaning of consciousness. Whether we're alone in the universe. We can't solve these things, but we get on with life anyway. We don't need to resolve everything to function. This is illogical. Yeah, probably, Jiho agreed. But it works for us. We're comfortable with uncertainty. Actually, we kind of expect it. In the monitoring room, Kelvon was frantically recording everything. The AI is engaging with him. It's never done that before. It's never needed to. The maze AI, designed by species that valued absolute logical consistency, found itself facing a mind that operated on completely different principles. A mind that could hold contradictory thoughts simultaneously without distress. A mind that treated the impossible as entertainment. And something unexpected happened. Jiho's presence in the solved state began to affect the maze itself. It wasn't telepathy or any form of psionic broadcast. It was something more fundamental. His absolute confidence that the paradoxes were just puzzles, his comfort with uncertainty, his casual dismissal of existential dread, all of this created a kind of cognitive ripple through the dimension. Mira, trapped in her seventh chamber among infinite voices, suddenly felt a change. The voices didn't disappear, but they became less overwhelming. She remembered something Jiho had said weeks ago during a casual conversation. Not all input has to be processed as truth. Sometimes data is just data. She stopped trying to reconcile all the voices. She simply acknowledged they existed and moved past them. Chamber 7 unlocked. She gasped in her pod, her crystalline form brightening with relief. Across the maze, other students reported similar experiences. The paradoxes didn't become easier exactly, but they became less psychologically crushing. The maze still tested them, but it no longer felt like it was trying to destroy them. Crix, the hexapod student, found its 6 mind suddenly able to stop arguing. The contradictions remained, but the urgent need to resolve them faded. It completed Chamber 3 and moved to Chamber 4. Even Tai-hyun, exhausted and close to collapse, felt something shift. His elaborate mathematical proof suddenly seemed less critical. He realized he'd been overcomplicating the problem. He simplified his approach and Chamber 4 unlocked. He lay in his pod, gasping, tears streaming down his face, but he was still conscious. Still sane in the monitoring room, chaos erupted. What's happening? All the stress indicators are dropping. Multiple students just achieved breakthrough simultaneously. This is unprecedented. The maze's difficulty hasn't changed, but the students' response to it has. Professor Kelvon stood frozen, understanding dawning on him like sunrise. The human isn't just solving the test differently. He's changing what the test means. His presence, his approach, it's creating a resonance that's affecting every other consciousness in the maze. Is this cheating? Someone asked. I don't know, Kelvon admitted. I don't think anyone knows. This has never happened before. A senior council member arrived, one of the ancient beings who had overseen the academy for millennia. They reviewed the situation in silence, their vast consciousness absorbing all the data. Wake the full council, they said finally. We have a decision to make. The 6-hour mark approached like a deadline for Judgment Day. In the monitoring room, every screen displayed a different story of struggle and triumph, failure and perseverance. But all eyes kept returning to one display, the one showing Jiho still sitting peacefully in his mental waiting room, completely unaware of the crisis he'd triggered. The Academy's ancient council had gathered for the first time in 3 centuries. 7 beings of immense age and power, each representing a different fundamental approach to consciousness and reality. They observed the test through the monitoring systems, their vast minds processing implications that would take younger species years to understand. The human has compromised the integrity of the examination, one council member stated. Their voice resonated through multiple dimensions. Has he? Another countered. Or has he simply revealed a flaw in our methodology that has existed for 10,000 years? The debate that followed was too complex for most of the monitoring staff to fully comprehend. It involved concepts of consciousness, reality, and truth that younger minds couldn't grasp. But the core question was simple enough. Did Jiho cheat, or did he just think differently? In the mind maze, the final minutes ticked down. Students began completing their 12th chambers, reaching the minimum threshold to pass. Others, recognizing they couldn't make it, prepared themselves for extraction and the psychological rehabilitation that would follow. Mira finished her 8th chamber, her best performance ever in any practice session or actual test. She emerged into a neutral space where successful students gathered to wait for time to expire. She looked around and saw Jiho sitting in the corner, apparently solving mental puzzles to pass the time. You, she said, her voice mixing relief and disbelief. You did something, I felt it. We all felt it. Jiho looked up, surprised. What do you mean? The maze changed. It became less crushing, like someone turned down the psychological pressure. She moved closer. That was you, wasn't it? I don't think I did anything, Jiho said honestly. I just solved the puzzles and waited here. 3 more students emerged into the gathering space. Then 5 more. Then a dozen. All of them reported the same experience. Around the 3-hour mark, something had shifted. The maze remained difficult, but it stopped feeling like it was trying to break them. Taehyun appeared, stumbling into the space and immediately collapsing. He'd completed 5 chambers, still a failing grade, but he was conscious and coherent. For a human, that was extraordinary. I felt you, he gasped at Jiho. Your presence, like a calm spot in a storm. I managed to finish 3 more chambers because of it before my mind gave out. Jiho didn't know what to say. He hadn't meant to affect anyone. He'd just approached the test the way he approached everything, with casual confidence that problems were meant to be solved, not feared. The 6-hour alarm sounded. Reality began to dissolve around them. Students opened their eyes in their pods, returning to physical consciousness after the longest 6 hours of their lives. Some emerged crying, others laughing with relief. A few had to be medically extracted, their minds too fragile to handle the transition. Jiho sat up in his pod, stretched, and immediately asked, Is there food? I'm starving. The monitoring room had gone silent. Professor Kelvon approached Jiho's pod slowly, like someone approaching a phenomenon they couldn't quite believe was real. How do you feel? He asked. Fine, good actually. That was interesting. Jiho climbed out of the pod. Did everyone else finish okay? Mira emerged from her pod and immediately went to Jiho. Without words, she performed a Valoran gratitude ritual, her crystalline hands touching his forehead gently. Thank you, she whispered. Whatever you did, thank you. Over the next hour, results were compiled. The numbers told a story that would be studied for generations. Jiho had completed all 20 chambers plus a secret 21st that the AI had generated specifically for him. Total time, 2 hours and 17 minutes. Stress indicators, none. Psychological damage, None. Mira had passed with 8 chambers, along with 15 other students who had been near the threshold when the shift occurred. Their success rate was directly tied to their proximity to the moment when Jiho's influence had rippled through the maze. Taehyun had failed with only 5 chambers, but he showed no signs of psychological trauma. He was exhausted, emotionally drained, but fundamentally okay. The extraction had been successful, and he'd suffered no lasting damage. In total, 32 students passed. That was a 64% pass rate, the highest in Academy history. Another 15 failed but remained psychologically stable, requiring no rehabilitation. Only 3 students needed serious psychological care, and even they were expected to recover fully. The test is compromised, a junior professor argued. These results are artificially inflated because of the humans' interference. Are they? Professor Kelvon had been reviewing data for the past hour, and his conclusions had shaken him to his core. Look at the pattern. Students who were already close to breakthrough found it easier to achieve. Students who were deeply trapped remained trapped. The human didn't solve the test for anyone. He just made it possible for students to solve it themselves by removing some of the psychological terror. That's still interference, is it? Or is it revealing that we've been testing for the wrong thing? Kelvon pulled up historical data. For 10,000 years, we've measured a student's ability to withstand psychological torture while solving paradoxes. We've assumed that suffering was a necessary component of cognitive excellence. What if we were wrong? The council had been listening to this debate in silence. Now they spoke. The humans' results stand, they declared. Moreover, we are commissioning a complete review of the Mind Maze's philosophical foundations. This institution was built on the principle that truth requires struggle. Perhaps truth simply requires thought, and we have confused the two. News of the results spread through the academy within hours. By evening, it had reached the quantum communication networks that connected the civilized galaxy. Xenopsychologists from 100 worlds requested interviews with Jiho. Academic institutions began debating the implications. 3 days later, Professor Kelvon called Jiho to his office. The room was beautiful, built from the same crystalline material as Valoran bodies, reflecting light in patterns that seemed to have meaning. Kelvon stood at the window looking out at the impossible space where the academy floated. "You've created quite a situation," he said without turning around. "I'm sorry," Jiho said. "I didn't mean to cause problems. Don't apologize." Kelvon finally turned to face him. "You've given us the most profound insight we've had in millennia. You've shown us that our definition of intelligence was too narrow, our methods too rigid." He pulled up a holographic display showing Jiho's solution patterns. "I've spent the past 3 days studying your approach. Do you know what I've realized? You treat impossible problems as temporary puzzles. You have faith that there's a solution even before you know what it is. That faith allows you to stay calm, which allows you to think clearly, which allows you to find solutions." "I guess that's true," Jiho said. "On Earth we just call it being optimistic." "Optimism," Kelvon repeated the word like it was holy. "We have the concept, but we've never considered it a cognitive tool. We've always seen it as a bias to be overcome." "It is a bias," Jiho admitted, "but sometimes biases are useful." Kelvon's surface brightened with something like excitement. "I have a proposition for you. The Academy wants to create a new research position. We need someone to help us understand human cognitive approaches, to see if we can teach elements of your problem-solving style to other species. Would you consider becoming a research fellow?" Jiho blinked in surprise. "Me? I'm just a student. I'm not qualified to teach professors." "You just revolutionized our understanding of consciousness," Kelvon said gently. "I think you're more qualified than you realize." 1 week after the Mind Maze test, Valoran Academy looked different. Not physically. The crystalline corridors and impossible architecture remained the same, but the atmosphere had changed. Students walked with less fear. Professors debated with more excitement than usual. The weight of tradition had lifted slightly, replaced by the thrill of discovery. Jiho sat in the cafeteria working on a crossword puzzle, just like he had a month ago. But now students kept approaching him. Some wanted to ask questions about his technique. Others just wanted to meet the human who had done the impossible. A few, from species that didn't interact much with humans, simply wanted to observe him, as if proximity might reveal his secret. "You're famous," Mira said, sitting down across from him. Her crystalline body was brighter than usual, reflecting her improved mood. "I don't want to be famous," Jiho replied, not looking up from his puzzle. "I just want to finish my degree and maybe get some decent coffee. The stuff they serve here tastes like recycled starship fuel." Mira laughed, a sound like wind chimes. Too late. The news has spread across 3 sectors. Xenopsychologists from the Confederation are requesting permission to study you. Someone started a discussion forum about human cognitive patterns. It has 40 million members already. Jiho sighed and set down his pencil. "This is weird. I just took a test." "You changed how we think about thinking," Mira corrected him. "That's not small, Jiho." The council had announced their decision that morning. Jiho's results would stand, and more importantly, they were commissioning a complete review of the mind maze. Professor Kelvon would lead a research team to study alternative cognitive approaches to problem solving, and Jiho would be joining that team as a research fellow. The decision had caused controversy. Some professors argued that 10,000 years of tradition shouldn't be overturned because one student thought differently. Others celebrated the chance to finally question methods they'd always found unnecessarily cruel. Taehyun approached their table, looking better than he had in weeks. He'd been cleared by the psychological evaluation team with no signs of lasting damage. He'd failed the test, but he'd survived it, which for a human was almost as remarkable. "I'm retaking it," he announced, sitting down. "In 3 months. Professor Kelvon thinks that if I can learn some of your approach, Jiho, I might be able to pass." "My approach is just not taking things too seriously," Jiho said with a shrug. "That's harder than it sounds," Taehyun replied. "But I'm going to try. They're developing a new training program based on your techniques. Pattern recognition over philosophical engagement. Accepting uncertainty instead of trying to resolve everything. Treating paradoxes as puzzles rather than threats." "Sounds good," Jiho said. "Want to practice? I have some puzzle books you can borrow." Taehyun smiled. "I'd like that." Over the following weeks, the research began. Professor Kelvon's team worked with Jiho to understand how human cognition handled impossible problems. They studied Earth's entertainment industry, fascinated by the fact that humans created paradoxes and contradictions for fun. They analyzed puzzle-solving strategies, game theory, even comedy, which they discovered was often based on accepting logical contradictions. Humor requires holding 2 incompatible ideas simultaneously, Kelvon marveled during one session. The setup creates an expectation, the punchline violates it, and humans find joy in that violation instead of distress. "Yeah, that's basically what jokes are," Jiho confirmed. "But don't you see? That's exactly what you did in the mind maze. You held the paradox and its solution simultaneously, without letting the contradiction bother you. You found it amusing rather than threatening." "I guess I did," Jiho said. He'd never thought about it that deeply before. The research expanded. Other human students began applying to Velaran Academy, drawn by news that their species' way of thinking was finally being recognized as valuable. The Academy's human enrollment increased from 2 students to 20 within a single cycle. Mira became Jiho's primary research partner. Her telepathic abilities let her sense the differences between how he processed information and how other species did. Together, they worked on translating human cognitive strategies into frameworks that other species could understand and potentially adopt. "It's not about making everyone think like humans," Mira explained during a presentation to the faculty. "It's about recognizing that intelligence comes in many forms. Humans use pattern recognition and comfort with uncertainty. My people pursue logical consistency and truth. The hexapods achieve understanding through consensus across multiple minds. None of these approaches is wrong. They're just different tools." The mind maze itself was redesigned. The new version still tested cognitive resilience, but it also measured adaptive problem-solving, creative thinking, and the ability to shift between different mental frameworks. Students could now choose different paths through the test based on their species' cognitive strengths. 3 months after the original test, Taehyun entered the newly designed mind maze. He'd spent the time working with Jiho's puzzle books, learning to recognize patterns and, most importantly, learning that not every problem needed to be solved with pure logical rigor. He passed with 14 chambers completed. When he emerged, he was exhausted but smiling. Jiho and Mira were waiting for him. "I did it," Taehyun said simply. "I actually did it." "Never doubted you," Jiho replied, which wasn't entirely true, but felt like the right thing to say. 6 months after the famous test, a paper was published in the galaxy's most prestigious academic journal. Its title was On the Utility of Unsolved Paradoxes: What Humanity Can Teach Post-Scarcity Civilizations. The paper argued that humanity's comfort with uncertainty and contradiction might be an evolutionary advantage in a universe that was fundamentally paradoxical. Species that had achieved technological mastery often forgot how to deal with unsolvable problems because they'd spent millennia solving everything else. But humans, still relatively primitive by galactic standards, had never lost that skill. The paper was controversial, cited, debated, and ultimately influential. It started conversations across hundreds of worlds about the nature of intelligence and the purpose of education. One evening, Jiho and Mira sat in the Academy's observation dome. Through the transparent ceiling, they watched ships arrive through quantum gates, bringing new students from dozens of worlds. The next semester was about to begin, and enrollment had doubled. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd failed that test?" Mira asked. Jiho considered this. "Probably not much. I'd have gone home, found something else to do. I never really thought of the test as that important." "That's what made you succeed," Mira said quietly. "You didn't need to pass, so you didn't feel pressure. You were free to just solve the problems." "Maybe," Jiho agreed. He pulled out his newest puzzle book. "Want to try a crossword? This one's pretty tricky." "This one's pretty tricky," Mira laughed. "Sure, but you'll have to explain the clues. Human wordplay still confuses me." They worked on the puzzle together as ships continued to arrive. Inside one of those ships was another human student, nervous and excited about attending Valoran Academy. They'd heard about Jiho, about the human who had changed everything. They wondered if they could live up to that example. They didn't realize that Jiho had never tried to change anything. He'd just been himself, and somehow that had been enough. 5 years passed. The mind maze was now considered one test among many, important but not definitive. The Academy offered multiple assessment tracks, each designed to challenge different cognitive strengths. What had once been a place of fear had become a place of discovery. Jiho graduated and stayed on as a permanent research fellow. His official title was Professor of Applied Human Pragmatism, which made him laugh every time he saw it on his door. He spent his days teaching other species how to approach problems with less rigidity and more creativity. He published papers. He gave lectures. He remained fundamentally uncomfortable with all the attention. Taehyun became a renowned mathematician, known for his ability to find elegant solutions to problems others overcomplicated. He credited Jiho with teaching him that sometimes the best proof was the simplest one. Mira achieved her doctorate and became one of the galaxy's leading experts on cross-species cognitive translation. She could take an idea from one species' framework and translate it into terms another species could understand. It was a skill that became increasingly valuable as the galaxy became more connected. And Professor Kelvon, ancient and wise, experienced something his species rarely did. He changed his mind about fundamental truths he'd held for centuries. He wrote a book called The Humility of Knowledge, which argued that even the most advanced civilizations had blind spots. And sometimes those blind spots could only be revealed by those who knew less, but saw differently. The final entry in Jiho's personal journal years after the famous test was simple. Solved a really good cryptic crossword today. Took me almost an hour. Reminded me that the best puzzles are the ones that seem impossible at first, but turn out to be elegant once you find the trick. Kind of like everything else in life, I guess. The universe is full of unsolvable problems, but that's okay. We don't need to solve everything. We just need to be comfortable with the questions and clever about finding the answers that matter. Also, the cafeteria finally got decent coffee. Only took 5 years. Somewhere in the galaxy, another impossible problem awaited. And somewhere, a human would probably treat it like a game, and somehow that would be exactly what was needed.